beginning of the chapter and reread that page, or we can like go from here. Would you guys prefer to like reread the chapter, including this page, or like or just like starting from the second page? Okay, so I want to start with this whole chapter because then we won't be missing any like important information maybe. So okay, chapter 4, painted faces and long hair. So I understand that a lot of you probably already read this first page like together yesterday, but judging by the name of the chapter, you can probably tell what this chapter is about, right? So I'm gonna ask someone in the in this meeting. So what do you associate with painted faces and long hair? Okay, I'll ask Carrie. What do you associate with painted faces and long hair? Carrie, if you have a microphone, please unmute yourself and answer. You can also type it in the chat if you don't have a microphone. Oh, okay. So I'll reread the question for you in case you didn't, since you didn't understand. So painted faces and long hair. I want you to tell me what you associate when when I say this. Associate with, it means like what do you think about or what do you relate to when I talk about when I mention painted faces and long hair, which is the name of this chapter. What does it remind you of? It's fine if you don't have the answer. I can ask someone else. Okay, Alyssa, can you answer this question?
Um, I think that it means they're like, you know, like on the last chapter or something, they said that they were English and not savages, but from the chapter title, I think it means they're becoming savages or something. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah, that's a pretty good association, right? Because like most people associate painted faces and long hair with like hunters, right? And like savages. So, yeah, good job. Okay, so who wants to start reading?
I'll read.
Okay.
The first rhythm that they became used to was the slow swing from dawn to quick dusk. They accepted the pleasures of morning, the bright sun, the whelming sea, and sweet air, as a time when play was good and life so full that hope was not necessary and therefore forgotten. Toward noon, as the floods of light fell more nearly to the perpendicular, the stark colors of a morning were smoothed in pearl and opalescence, as the he as though the impending sun's height gave him momentum, became a blow that they ducked, running to the shade and lying there, perhaps even sleeping. Strange things happened at midday. The glittering sea rose up, moved apart in planes of blatant impossibility. The coral reef and the few stunted ponds that clung to the more elevated parts would float up into the sky, would quiver, be plucked apart, run like raindrops on a wire, or be repeated as in an odd succession of mirrors. Sometimes land loomed when there was no land and flicked out like a bubble as the children watched. Piggy discounted all this learnedly as a mirage. and since no boy could reach even the reef over the stretch of water where the snapping sharks waited, they grew accustomed to these mysteries and ignored them, just like they ignored the miraculous throbbing stars. At midday, the illusions merged into the sky, and there the sun gazed down like an angry eye. Then, at the end of the afternoon, the mirage subsided and the horizon became level and blue and clipped as the sun declined. There was another time of comparative coolness, but menaced by the coming of dark. When the sun sank, darkness dropped on the island like an extinguisher, and soon the shelters were full of restlessness under the remote stars. Nevertheless, the northern European tradition of work, play, and food right through the day made it impossible for them to adjust themselves wholly to this new rhythm. Llewellyn Percival had early crawled into a shelter and stayed there for 2 days, talking, singing, and crying till they thought him batty and were faintly amused. Ever since then he had been peaked, red-eyed, and miserable, a little one who played little and cried often. The smaller boys were known now by the generic title of Litlins. The decrease in size from Ralph down was gradual, and though there was a dubious region inhabited by Simon and Robert and Morris, nevertheless no one had any difficulty in recognizing big ones at one end and little ones at the other. The undoubted little ones, those aged about 6, led a quite distinct and at the same time intense life of their own. They ate most of the day, picking fruit where they could reach it and not particular about ripeness and quality. They were now used to stomach aches and a sort of chronic diarrhea. They suffered untold terrors in the dark and huddled together for comfort. Apart from food and sleep, they found time for play, aimless and trivial, in the white sand in the white sand by the bright water. They cried for their mothers much less often than might have been expected. They were very brown and filthily dirty. They obeyed the summons of a conch partly because Rolf blew it, and he was big enough to be a link with the adult world of authority, and partly because they enjoyed the entertainment of the assemblies. But otherwise they seldom bothered with the big ones, and their passionately emotional and corporate life was their own. They had built castles in the sand at the bar of the little river. These castles were about 1 foot high and were decorated with shells, withered flowers and interesting stones. Round the castles was a complex of marks, tracks, walls, railway lines that were of significance only if inspected with the eye at beach level. The little ones played here, if not happily, at least with absorbed attention. Often as many as 3 of them would play the same game together. 3 were playing now. Henry was the biggest of them. He was also a distant relative of that other boy whose mulberry marked face had not been seen since the evening of the great fire. But he was not old enough to understand this, and if he had been told that the other boy had gone home in an aircraft, he would have accepted this statement without fuss or disbelief.
Okay, thank you. So this so let's go back a little bit and the part where it talks about how the undoubted little ones, those aged about 6, led a quite distinct and at the same time intense life of their own. They ate most of the day, picking fruit where they could reach it and not particular about ripeness and quality. They were now used to stomach aches and a sort of chronic diarrhea. So again, as I was talking before about how like this kind of relates to Adam and Eve, right? How these fruit on the seemingly perfect island, they give the children diarrhea. And like a direct relation of this to the Garden of Eden, which is, as I said before, widely used in literature, is like it's heavily foreshadowing and implying that this island isn't as perfect as it seems. In fact, quite the opposite. Okay, also guys, please don't spam the chat with faces. And you can also tell that the little ones are now used to having this diarrhea. They're able to like pick the fruit and eat it and accept the fact that they will have diarrhea. And again, a direct relation of this to Garden Eden is like after it goes like the pretty sure the tale goes that they were sentenced to live on Earth after eating the forbidden fruit, but they still eat the fruit on Earth. So I apologize if I got the tale a little bit rusty because I haven't like gone over it in a long time, but it's very much related to Eve. Like the Garden of Eden, William Golding is very much directly relating it to this. So, anyone else want to read the next page? Okay, I'll choose someone who hasn't participated that much. Okay, Franklin Zhao, I think you're
Okay.
new here.
Yeah, I wasn't here last class. Okay. Henry was a bit of a leader this afternoon because the other two were
Percival?
Percival and Johnny, the smallest boys on the island. Percival was mouse-colored and had not been very attractive even to his mother. Johnny was well built, with fair hair and a natural belligerence. Just now he was being obedient because he was interested, and the three children kneeling in the sand were at peace. Roger and Morris came out of the forest. They were relieved from duty at the fire and had come down for a swim. Roger led the way straight through the castles, kicking them over, burying the flowers, scattering the chosen stones. Morris followed, laughing, and added to the destruction. The three Littons paused in their what?
Little ones? It's kind of like a slang, I guess.
The three little ones paused in their game and looked up. As it happened, the particular marks in which they were interested had not been touched, so they made no protest. Only Percival began to whimper with an eye full of sand, and Morus hurried away. In his other life, Morus had received
chastisement. It means like punishment.
Chastisement for filling a younger eye with sand. Now though there was no parent to let fall a heavy hand, Morus still felt the unease of wrongdoing. At the back of his mind formed the uncertain outlines of an excuse. He muttered something about a swim and broke into a trot. Roger remained watching the little ones. He was not noticeably darker than when he had dropped in, but the shock of black hair down his nape and low on his forehead seemed to suit his gloomy face and made what had seemed at first unsociable remoteness into something forbidding. Percival finished his whimper and went on playing, for the tears had washed the sand away. Johnny watched him with china blue eyes then began to fling up sand in a shower, and presently Percival was crying again. When Henry tired of his play and wandered off along the beach, Roger followed him, keeping beneath the palms and drifting casually in the same direction. Henry walked at a distance from the palms and the shade because he was too young to keep himself out of the sun. He went down the beach and bruised himself at the water's edge.
Busied?
What?
Busied himself? Also ignore this period. I think that's a typo.
Busied himself. Wait, where?
Here.
Busied himself at the water's edge. The great Pacific tide was coming, and every few seconds the relatively still water of the lagoon heaved forward an inch. There were creatures that lived in this last fling of the sea, tiny transparencies that came questing in the water over the hot, dry sand. With impalpable organs of sense, they examined the snow field. Perhaps food had appeared where at the last incursion there had... What?
Never mind. Just keep on going, don't worry.
There had been none. Bird droppings, insects perhaps, any of the strewn detritus of landward life. Lake Mimrand.
Myriad, it's like a bunch.
Lake Mimrand of tiny teeth in a saw. The transparencies came scavenging over the beach. This was fascinating to Henry. He poked about with a bit of stick that itself was wave-worn and whitened and vagrant, and tried to control the motions of the scavengers. He made little runnels that the tide filled and tried to crowd them with creatures. He became absorbed beyond mere happiness as he felt himself exercising control over living things. He talked to them, urging them, ordering them. Driven back by the tide, his footprints became bays in which they were trapped and gave him the illusion of mastery. He squatted on his hams at the water's edge, bowed with a shock of hair falling over his forehead and past his eyes, and the afternoon sun emptied down invisible arrows. Roger waited too. At first he had hidden behind a great palm, but Henry's absorption with the transparencies was so obvious that at last he stood out in full view. He looked along the beach. Percival had got off crying, and Johnny was left in triumphant possession of the castles. He sat there, crooning to himself and throwing sand at an imaginary Percival. Behind him, Roger could see the platform and the glints of spray where Ralph and Simon and Piggy and Morris were diving in the pool. He listened carefully, but could only just hear them. A sudden breeze shook the fringe of palm trees so that the fronds tossed and fluttered. 60 feet above Roger, several nuts, fibrous lumps as big as rugby balls, were loose from their stems. They fell about him with a series of hard thumps, and he was not touched. Roger did not consider his escape, but looked from the nuts to Henry back and again.
Okay, good. So everybody understands what's happening, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. So basically, they're like the Henry and Percival are prodding at the jellyfish, and they're basically like nothing important's really happening. It's just describing some of their everyday activities, I would say. Okay, so who wants to read next?
Can I read?
Sure.
The subsoil beneath the palm trees was a raised beach, and generations of palms had worked loose in this the stones that had lain on the sands of another shore. Roger stooped, picked up a stone, aimed and threw it at Henry, threw it to miss. The stone, that token of preposterous time, bounced 5 yards to Henry's right and fell in the water. Roger gathered a handful of stones and began to throw them. Yet there was a space round Henry, perhaps 6 yards in diameter, into which he dare not throw. Here, invisible yet strong, was the taboo of the old life. Round the squatting child was the protection of parents and school and policeman and the law. Roger's arm was conditioned by a civilization that knew nothing of him and was in ruins. Henry was surprised by the plopping sounds in the water. He abandoned the noiseless transparencies and pointed at the center of the spreading rings like a setter. This side and that the stones fell, and Henry turned obediently, but always too late to see the stones in the air. At last he saw one and laughed, looking for a friend who was teasing him. But Roger had whipped behind the palm again and was leaning against it, breathing quickly, his eyelids fluttering. Then Henry lost interest in stones and wandered off. Roger. Jack was standing under a tree about 10 yards away. When Roger opened his eyes and saw him, a dark shadow crept beneath the swarthiness of his skin, but Jack noticed nothing. He was eager, impatient, and beckoning so that Roger went to him. There was a small pool at the end of the river, dammed back by sand and full of white water lilies and needle-like reeds. Here Sam and Eric were waiting, and Bill Jack, concealed from the sun, knelt by the pool and opened the two large leaves that he carried. One of them contained white clay, the other red. By them lay a stick of charcoal brought down from the fire. Jack explained to Roger as he worked. They don't smell me, they see me, I think. Something pink under the trees. He smeared on some clay. If only I'd have some green. He turned to a hot concealed face up to Roger and answered the incomprehension of his gaze. For hunting, like in war, dazzle paint like things trying to look like something else. He twisted in the urgency of telling, like moths on a tree trunk. Roger understood and nodded gravely. The twins moved toward Jack and began to protest timidly about something. Jack waved them away. Shut up. He rubbed the charcoal sticks between the patches of red and white on his face. No, you two come with me. He peered at his reflection and disliked it. He bent down, took up a double handful of lukewarm water, and rubbed the mess from his face. Freckles and sandy eyebrows appeared. Roger smiled unwillingly. You don't half look like a mess. Jack planned his new face. He made one cheek and one eye socket white. Then he rubbed red over the other half of his face and slashed a black bar of charcoal across from right ear to left jaw. He looked in the pool for his reflection, but his breathing troubled the mirror. Samneric, get me a coconut, an empty one.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now that we've read like enough to have actual context over what's happening, I'm going to ask you guys some questions. Okay, So firstly, in the scene where Johnny is throwing sand at Percival, it says that he had formed uncertain lines of an excuse in his mind. I want you to answer this question. What is happening? Why uncertain? What is the significance of Johnny's behavior? Hold on, let me try to find the page this was on. Yep, it should be here. It's about here, the uncertain outlines of an excuse. Okay, I'm gonna ask Jason.
Yeah,
Do you want me to reread the question for you?
sure.
It says here that, hold on. At the back of the mind, he formed the uncertain outlines of an excuse. This is Henry forming the, wait, no, not Henry, sorry. I think this is Johnny forming the outlines of an excuse for throwing sand at Percival. So, what is happening? Why uncertain? What is the significance of Johnny's behavior? Jason, please answer this question.
He probably became a bit more like sensitive.
Well, I guess sensitive could like not really be the right word to describe it actually. But this just kind of shows that like there's still remnants of their old life, right? Because he was afraid of the gentle chastisement that he received from parents in before they got like stranded on this island. Even though there's no more like parents to punish them now, you can tell that he's still pretty like guilty. He has qualms about throwing sand in Percival's eyes because he probably knows that what he's doing is wrong and he's guilty for it. But that's why he's forming the outlines of an excuse because he doesn't really want to handle this guilt. But you can tell how this behavior like goes from in before like they got stranded on this island. This behavior would firstly be like, for example, Johnny throwing sand in some kid's eyes, and then he would get scolded by his parents and probably spanked. But now, it's more or less just this fear of this guilt and getting stranded on this island would probably just like turn them into savages and kind of just make this guilt really primitive, I guess. But you can probably tell that he definitely still has humanity left in him by this fact that he's feeling guilty about throwing sand in Percival's face, although he doesn't really regret it or feel bad for Percival. Okay. And okay, hold on. Another question for you guys. Okay, on this page, Jack paints a mask on himself. Now, mask. Why do you think his painted face liberated Jack from shame and self-consciousness? I'm going to ask Carrie to answer this question. Carrie, do you have a microphone? If you do have one, please unmute your microphone and answer the question. If you don't, you can type the answer in the chat.
What was the question again?
Okay, so on this page, Jack smears a sort of mask on himself. Why do you think his painted face liberated Jack from shame and self-consciousness? Do you understand the question?
Kind of.
Okay, you can just like explain through your best knowledge of what's happening, okay? Okay, I'll read the question for you guys one more time. Mask. Why do you think Jack's painted face liberated him from shame and self-consciousness?
Wait, like, does liberated mean like? What
Read.
does liberated mean?
Liberated means like essentially like freed him from shame and self-consciousness, or like prevented him from shame and self-consciousness.
Mm, like, because when he smeared it on his face, he like kind of like before he was already like going crazy and losing himself a little. So now that he's done that, like maybe he's losing himself more. So he doesn't really know what's happening anymore.
Okay, interesting. So it seems as if Jack is almost self-conscious of his face when he's not hunting. He's almost ashamed of it because he now views himself as a full-time hunter. And I think, personally, Jack is probably like putting on this mask to hide himself from the reality, which is he is a child who is stranded on an island with nowhere to go. And he sees himself as the strong hunter, and this probably brings him a lot of shame. So this mask is really to hide behind this shame, self-consciousness of who he really is, right? He wants to be a hunter, but he is really just a kid who's I'm pretty sure he's 11 years old. Okay. Okay, so does anyone want to keep on reading? If no one keeps on reading, then I'll just try to finish this chapter.
I'll read.
Okay,
Uh,
so read from he knelt, holding the shell of water.
Now, holding the shell of water, a rounded patch of sunlight fell on his face, and a brightness appeared in the depths of the water. He looked in astonishment, no longer at himself, but at an awesome stranger. He split the water and leapt to his feet, laughing excitedly. Beside the pool,
Sinewy?
his sinewy water held up a mask that drew their eyes and appalled them. He began to dance, and his laughter became a bloodthirsty snarling. He capered towards Bill, and the mask was a thing on its own, behind which Jack hid, liberated from shame and self-consciousness. The face of red and white and black swung through the air and jigged toward Bill. Bill started up laughing. Then suddenly he fell silent and blundered away through the bushes. Jack rushed towards the twins. The rest are making a line. Come on, I'll creep up and stab. The mask compelled them. Ralph climbed out Rolf climbed out of the bathing pool and trotted up the beach and sat in the shade beneath the palms. His fair hair was plastered over his eyebrows and he pushed it back. Simon was floating in the water and kicking with his feet, and Morris was practicing diving. Piggy was moving about, aimlessly picking up things and discarding them. The rock pools which so fascinated him were covered by the tide, so he was without an interest until the tide went back. Presently, seeing Ralph under the palms, he came and sat by him. Piggy wore the remainders of a pair of shorts. His fat body was golden brown, and the glasses still flashed when he looked at anything. He was the only boy on the island who never seemed to grow. The rest were shock-headed, but Piggy's hair still lay in wisps over his head as though baldness were his natural state, and this imperfect covering would soon go, like the velvet on a young stag's antlers. "I've been thinking," he said. "About a clock. We could make a sundial. We could put a stick in the sand, and then the effort to express the mathematical processes involved was too great. He made a few passes instead. And an airplane and a TV set," said Rolf sourly, "and a steam engine." Piggy shook his head. "You have to have a lot of metal things for that," and he said, "and we haven't got no metal, but we got a stick." Rolf turned and smiled involuntarily. His Piggy was a bore. His fat, his asthma, and his matter-of-fact ideas were dull, but there was always a little pleasure to be got out of pulling his leg, even if if one did it by accident. Piggy saw the smile and misinterpreted as friendliness. There had grown tacitly among the big ones the opinion that Piggy was an outsider, not only by accent, which did not matter, but by fat and asthma and specs, and a certain disinclination for manual labor. Now, finding that something he had said made Ralph smile, he rejoiced and pressed his advantage. "We got a lot of sticks. We could have a sundial each. Then we should know what the time was. A fat lot of good that would be. You said you wanted things done, so as we could be rescued." "Oh, shut up." He leapt to his feet and trotted back to the pool just as Morris did a rather poor dive. Ralph was glad of a change to, of a chance to change the subject. He shouted as Morris came to the surface. "Belly flop, belly flop."
Okay, thank you. So it's been pretty obvious up until now that Piggy is not treated as well as the other big ones, right? And it's made clear that he's essentially tacitly like an outsider to the big ones. And to the people who don't know what tacitly means, tacit means without having to be spoken, just like a silent understanding, I guess. So that kind of just confirms what the big ones really think about Piggy, right? And we don't have that much time, but I really want to finish this chapter because then it'll be easier to continue on. So I'll just read from now on, okay? Morris flashed a smile at Ralph, who slid easily into the water. Of all boys, he was the most at home here. But today, irked by the mention of rescue, the useless, footling mention of rescue, even the green depths of water and the shattered golden sun held no balm. Instead of remaining and playing, he swam with steady strokes under Simon and crawled out of the other side of the pool to lie there, sleek and streaming like a seal. Piggy, always clumsy, stood up and came to stand by him, so Ralph rolled on his stomach and pretended not to see. The mirages had died away, and so gloomily he ran his eye along the taut blue line of the horizon. The next moment he was on his feet and shouting, "Smoke! Smoke!" Simon tried to sit up in the water and got a mouthful. Morris, who had been standing ready to dive, swayed on his heels, made a bolt for the platform, and then swerved back to the grass under the palms. There he started to pull on his tattered shorts, to be ready for anything. Ralph stood, one hand holding back his hair, the other clenched. Simon was climbing out of the water. Piggy was rubbing his glasses on his shorts and squinting at the sea. Morris had both legs through one of his shorts. Of all the boys, Ralph was still. "I can't see no smoke," said Piggy incredulously. "I can't see no smoke. Ralph, where is it?" Ralph said nothing. Now both his hands were clenched over his forehead so that the fair hair was kept out of his eyes. He was leaning forward and already the salt was whitening his body. "Ralph, where's the ship?" Simon stood by, looking from Ralph to the horizon. Morris's trousers gave way with a sigh, and he abandoned them as a wreck, rushed towards the forest, and then came back again. The smoke was a tight little knot on the horizon and was uncoiling slowly. Beneath the smoke was a dot that might be a funnel. Ralph's face was pale as he spoke to himself. "They'll see our smoke." Piggy was looking in the right direction now. It don't look like much. He turned round and peered up the mountain. Ralph continued to watch the ship ravenously. Color was coming back into his face. Simon stood by him silent. I know I can't see very much, said Piggy, but have we got any smoke? Ralph moved impatiently, still watching the ship. The smoke on his mountain. Morris came running and stared out to sea. Both Simon and Piggy were looking at the mountain. Piggy screwed up his face, but Simon cried out as though he had hurt himself. Ralph! Ralph! The quality of his speech twisted Ralph on the sand. You tell me, said Piggy anxiously. Is there a signal? Ralph looked back at the dispersing smoke on the horizon, then up at the mountain. Ralph, please, is there a signal? Simon put out his hand timidly to touch Ralph, but Ralph started to run, splashing through the shallow end of the bathing pool, across the hot white sand and under the palms. A moment later he was battling with the complex undergrowth that was already engulfing the scar. Simon ran after him, then Morris. Piggy shouted, Ralph, please, Ralph. Then he too started to run, stumbling over Morris's discarded shorts before he was across the terrace. Behind the four boys, the smoke moved gently across the horizon, and on the beach, Henry and Johnny were throwing sand at Percival, who was crying quietly again, and three were in complete ignorance of the excitement. By the time Ralph had reached the landward end of the scar, he was using precious breaths to swear. He did desperate violence to his naked body among the rasping creepers so that blood was sliding over him. Just where the steep ascent of the mountain began, he stopped. Morris was only a few yards behind him. Piggy Specs, shouted Ralph. If the fire's all out, we need them. He stopped and shouting and swayed on his feet. Piggy was only just visible, bumbling up from the beach. Ralph looked at the horizon, then up to the mountain. Was it better to fetch Piggy's glasses, or would the ship have gone? Or if they climbed on, supposing the fire was all out, and they had to watch Piggy crawling nearer and nearer, and the ship sinking under the horizon? Balanced on a high peak of need, agonized by indecision, Ralph cried out, Oh God, oh God. Simon, struggling with bushes, caught his breath. His face was twisted. Ralph blundered on, savaging himself, as the wisp of smoke moved on. The fire was dead. They saw that straight away, saw what they had really known on the beach when the smoke of home had beckoned. The fire was out, smokeless and dead. The watchers were gone. A pile of unused fuel lay ready. Ralph turned to see. The horizon stretched, impersonal once more, barren of all but the faintest trace of smoke. Ralph ran stumbling across the rock, saved himself on the edge of the pink cliff, and screamed at the ship, Come back! Come back! He ran backwards and forwards along the cliff, his face always to the sea. His voice rose insanely. Come back! Come back! Simon and Morris arrived. Ralph looked at them with unwinking eyes. Simon turned away, smearing the water from his cheeks. Ralph reached inside himself the worst word he knew. They let the bloody fire go out. He looked down the unfriendly side of the mountain. Piggy arrived, out of breath and whimpering like a little one. Ralph clenched his fists and went very red. The intentness of his gaze, the bitterness of his voice pointed for him. There they are. A procession had appeared, far down among the pink stones that lay near the water's edge. Some of the boys wore black caps, but otherwise they were almost naked. They lifted sticks in the air together when they came to an easy patch. They were chanting, something to do with the bundle that the errant twins carried so carefully. Ralph picked out Jack easily, even at that distance, tall, red-haired, and inevitably leading the procession. Simon looked now, from Ralph to Jack, as he had looked from Ralph to the horizon, and what he saw seemed to make him afraid. Ralph said nothing more, but waited while the procession came nearer. The chant was audible, but at the distance stood wordless. Behind Jack walked the twins, carrying a great stake on their shoulders. The gutted carcass of a pig swung from the stake, swinging heavily as the twins toiled over the uneven ground. The pig's head hung down with gaping neck and seemed to be searching for something on the ground. At last the words of the chant floated up to them, across the bowl of blackened wood and ashes. Kill the pig, cut her throat, spill her blood. Yet as the words became audible, the procession reached the steepest part of the mountain, and in a minute or two the chant had died away. Piggy sniffled, and Simon shushed him quickly as though he had spoken too loudly in church. Jack, his face smeared with clays, reached up the top first and hailed Ralph excitedly with a lifted spear. Look, we've killed a pig. We stole up on them. We got in a circle. Voices broke in from the hunters. We got in a circle. We crept up. The pig squealed. The twins stood with the pig swinging between them, dropping black guts on the rock. They seemed to share one wide, ecstatic grin. Jack had too many things to tell Ralph at once. Instead, he danced a step or two, then remembered his dignity and stood up, grinning. He noticed blood on his hands and grimaced distastefully, looked for something on which to clean them, and wiped them on his shorts and laughed. Ralph spoke. "You let the fire go out." Jack checked, vaguely irritated by this irrelevance, but was too happy to let it worry him. "We can light the fire again. You should have been with us, Ralph. We had a smashing time. The twins got knocked over. We hit the pig. I fell on top." "I cut the pig's throat," said Jack proudly, and yet twitched as he said it. "Can I borrow yours, Ralph, to make a nick in the hilt?" The boys chattered and danced. The twins continued to drink. "There were lashings and blood," said Jack, laughing and chattering. "You should have seen it. We'll go hunting every day." Ralph spoke again hoarsely. He had not moved. "You let the fire go out." This repetition made Jack uneasy. He looked at the twins, then back at Ralph. We had to have them in the hunt," he said, "or there wouldn't have been enough for a ring." He flushed, conscious of a fault. "The fire's only been out for an hour or two. We can light it up again." He noticed Ralph's scarred nakedness, the somber silence of all four of them. He sought, charitable in his happiness, to include them in the thing that had happened. His mind was crowded with memories of the knowledge that he had come to them when he closed in on the struggling pig, knowledge that they had outwitted a living thing, imposed their will on it, and taken away its life like a long satisfying drink. He spread his arms wide. "You should have seen the blood." The hunters were silent now, but at this they buzzed again. Ralph flung back his hair. One arm pointed at the empty horizon. His voice was loud and savage, and struck them into silence. There was a ship. Jack, faced at once with too many awful implications, ducked away from them. He laid a hand on the pig and drew his knife. Ralph brought his arm down, fist clenched, and his voice shook. "There was a ship out there. You said you'd keep the fire going, and you let it out." He took a step toward Jack, who turned and faced him. "They might have seen us. We might have gone home." This was too bitter for Piggy, who forgot his timidity in the agony of his loss. He began to cry out shrilly. "You and your blood, Jack Merridew. You and your hunting. We might have gone home." Ralph pushed Piggy to one side. "I was chief, and you were going to do what I said. You talk. But you can't even build huts. Then you go off hunting and out the fire." He turned away, silent for a moment. Then his voice came again on a peak of feeling. "There was a ship." One of the smaller hunters began to wail. The dismal truth was filtering through to everybody. Jack went very red as he hacked and pulled at the pig. The job was too much. We needed everyone. Ralph turned. "You could have had everyone when the shelters were finished, but you had to hunt. We needed meat." Jack stood up as he said this, the bloody knife in his hand. The two boys faced each other. There was a brilliant world of hunting, tactics, fierce exhilaration, skill, and there was a world of longing and baffled common sense. Jack transferred the knife to his left hand and smudged blood over his forehead as he pushed down the plastered hair. Piggy began again. "You didn't ought to have let the fire out. You said you'd keep the smoke going." This from Piggy, and the wails of agreement from some of the hunters drove Jack to violence. The bolting look came into his blue eyes. He took a step, and able at last to hit someone, he stuck his fist into Piggy's stomach. Piggy sat down with a grunt. Jack stood over him. His voice was vicious with humiliation. "You would you, fatty?" Ralph made a step forward and smacked Piggy's head. Piggy's glasses flew off and tinkled on the rocks. Piggy cried out in terrors. "My specs!" He went crouching and feeling over the rocks, but Simon, who got there first, found them for him. Passions beat about Simon on the mountain top with awful wings. One side's broken. Okay, so it's 11:57. I actually have a class at 12 o'clock, so we're gonna have to end the meeting a little bit early today. So basically what happened is there was a ship, and the hunters, they all went hunting, and instead of their promise, which was Jack would have half of the choir boys keeping the smoke going, they all went hunting, and then the fire went out. And then this resulted in the ship not seeing the smoke that they were meant to create. So I'll go more into depth with this tomorrow. This is page 41, and I'll ask you guys some questions tomorrow. So
Wait, can I ask a question?
yep, sure.
Is there gonna be class on Saturdays? Because yesterday you weren't here.
Well, I'm never going to be here on Saturdays because I have another class that overlaps with this class on Saturdays. Usually I would get someone else to like just read, but like if you guys would prefer, we can just like cancel class on Saturdays and just have it on every other day of the week, except for like Saturdays.
Wait, what's
Okay.
a Google Classroom code?
I'm not sure. You can ask Jason for that.
Jason, what is it?
Go to mindkey.com.
Okay.
Okay, fine. I'll send you the link. Give me a sec. The class
Okay,
code.
posted.
It's ZUETGXX. To make things more simple, check the chat. Bloop.
Okay, guys. So, anyways, we're gonna.
It's ZUETGXX.
Did you put a space in front of it?
There's no spaces, I think. Okay,
I hope that's simple.
so can you ask Jason? Could you ask Mr. Lin to stop recording?
Okay, the only way to stop recording is to stop the meeting.
Okay then. Well,
Well,
class is
Oh.
over, guys. See
please
you
leave a
guys-
like. Please leave a like down below. Press that subscribe button.
All right, very cool. I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, bye. Thank you for the class.
She just left. That was a bit too late.
Bye,
Well-
anyways.
Bye. I'm gonna end the. I'm gonna